Montana, winter of 1897. If you rode past Sarah Morton's homestead that December, you'd have seen something strange. Smoke rising from the chimney, yes, but also thin trails of vapor curling from 6 iron pipes jutting out the side of her cabin like metal ribs. Neighbors slowed their horses. Some pointed. Most shook their heads. Inside that 14 by 16-foot shack, 2 children slept warm under a single quilt. Outside, the wind carved through the Judith Basin at 30 below zero. And Sarah, a widowed blacksmith's wife who wasn't supposed to know anything about metalwork, was burning half the firewood her neighbors used while keeping her cabin 20 degrees warmer. They called it dangerous. They called it ugly. They called it a waste of good pipe. Until the worst cold snap in a decade proved them dead wrong. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to see changed how frontier families survived winter, and I'm going to show you the exact measurements that silenced an entire settlement. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and I promise you'll walk away with something you can actually use. Sarah Morton wasn't supposed to be alone. Her husband, Daniel, had been the blacksmith in a scattered cluster of homesteads near Judith Basin, Montana, a man who could forge a wagon axle or shoe a horse in weather that froze spit before it hit the ground. When he died in the spring of 1897, kicked by a spooked mare, he left Sarah with 2 children, a cabin, a forge she barely knew how to light, and a problem she couldn't afford to ignore. Winter. The cabin measured 14 feet by 16. Log walls chinked with clay and moss. A stone hearth on the east wall with a sheet iron stove Daniel had built himself. 1 window facing south. A loft where the children, Emma, 8, and Jacob, 6, slept under whatever quilts and hides Sarah could stack on them. It should have been enough. But that first winter without Daniel, Sarah learned what every widow on the frontier learned fast. A cabin built by a strong man assumes a strong man will keep it warm. Daniel used to rise 3, 4 times a night to feed the stove. He'd split a cord of wood in an afternoon. He'd haul logs on his back through snow that came up to Sarah's waist. Sarah couldn't do that. Not alone. Not with 2 children and a forge to keep alive if she wanted to survive. By November, she was burning through 18 to 20 logs a night just to keep the cabin tolerable. The children woke coughing. Ice formed on the inside of the window by dawn. The floor stayed so cold that Emma refused to climb down from the loft until Sarah had the fire roaring. And the wood pile was shrinking faster than Sarah could split new logs. She'd stand at the stove, feeding it, watching the flames claw upward, and she'd press her hand to the stovepipe where it entered the chimney. Almost too hot to touch. Then she'd crouch low, press her palm to the floorboards near the wall. Cold as river stone. All that heat, she thought, climbing straight up and out into the night. Gone. Wasted. While her children shivered 6 feet away. There had to be another way. Sarah knew metalwork the way most wives knew it, by watching. Daniel had let her pump the bellows when he needed both hands on a piece. He'd explained why iron needs to glow orange before it bends, why a weld that looks good can still crack under weight, why you never quench a blade too fast. She wasn't a blacksmith, but she understood heat. The idea came to her one night in early December when she was splitting kindling by lantern light. The stove was roaring. The stovepipe glowed dull red where it rose from the firebox. And she thought, what if that heat didn't just rise? What if it had to travel farther before it escaped? She walked to the forge the next morning and dug through Daniel's scrap pile. 6 sections of 2-inch iron pipe, salvaged from a broken thresher. Not perfect. 1 had a dent. 2 were slightly different lengths. But they were straight, and they were iron, and Sarah had an idea that wouldn't leave her alone. It took her 4 days. She cleared space around the stove, measured twice, and started cutting. The firebox was cast iron, thick enough to drill without cracking. She used Daniel's brace and bit to bore holes through both sides. 2 on the left, 2 on the right, 2 out the back. Slow work. Her hands blistered. Jacob brought her water. Emma asked what she was building, and Sarah said, something your father would have thought of first. Then came the welding. She'd watched Daniel do it 100 times, but watching isn't the same as doing. The forge had to be hot enough to bring 2 pieces of iron to near liquid at the edge, then hammer them together before they cooled. Too cold, the bond fails. Too hot, the metal burns away. Sarah heated the pipe ends and the edges of the drilled holes until they glowed orange-white. Then she pressed them together, hammering the joint flat, adding fresh iron to fill gaps, beating it smooth. Her shoulders ached. Sparks burned holes in her sleeves. The children watched from the doorway, silent. When she finished, the stove looked like something diseased. 6 iron pipes jutted out at odd angles, 2 horizontal through each side, 2 slanting out the back. She'd connected them with elbows and short straight sections, so the smoke would have to snake through the entire system before reaching the chimney. Serpentine. Awkward. Ugly as sin. But when she lit the first test fire, she pressed her hand to the middle pipe. It was warm. Not blazing. Warm. And it stayed warm for an hour after the fire died down. That's when she knew. Word spread fast in a settlement where 20 families shared one general store. Sarah Morton welded pipes into her stove. At first, people were curious. A few neighbors rode out to see it. They stood in her cabin, staring at the iron ribs poking out of the firebox like some mechanical beast. One man tapped a pipe with his knuckle, frowned, and said, "This is going to crack from the heat. Iron don't hold up to that kind of stress." Another, Calvin Priest, who'd built half the cabins in the basin, shook his head slow. "Dangerous, Sarah. You're trapping heat where it shouldn't be trapped. That's a fire hazard. Those pipes get too hot. You'll have flames shooting sideways." "I've seen it." Sarah said nothing, just stoked the fire and waited. But the judgment didn't stop at the technical. "Blacksmith's widow playing blacksmith," someone muttered at the store. Daniel would be rolling in his grave. "Not proper for a woman to be welding," said Edna Colfax, the pastor's wife, loud enough for Sarah to hear. What kind of example is that for her daughter? The children felt it worse. Emma came home from school one afternoon with her jaw clenched tight. Another girl had said her mother builds crazy things like a madwoman. Jacob got into a fist fight with a boy who called the cabin the spider house because of the pipes. And then there was Garrett Stillwell. Garrett was the settlement's senior builder, 63 years old, apprenticed to a stonemason in Pennsylvania before moving west. He'd built chimneys that never smoked, hearths that held heat for hours, cabins that stood through 20 winters without a cracked log. People trusted Garrett's opinion on anything involving fire, stone, or wood. He visited Sarah's cabin in mid-December, unannounced, walked straight to the stove, crossed his arms, and stared at the pipes like they'd offended him personally. "Iron conducts heat too fast," he said. "That's basic thermodynamics, Sarah. Those pipes will soak up the heat and radiate it right out the walls. You'd be better off with a stone hearth. This," he tapped a pipe with his boot, "this is a waste of good material and dangerous besides. When those welds fail under thermal stress, you'll have smoke pouring into the cabin. Or worse." Sarah met his eyes. "They haven't failed yet." "They will," Garrett said, and he left. That night, Sarah sat by the stove with Emma asleep in her lap and Jacob curled against her side. The pipes hummed faintly with retained heat. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Inside, she'd burned 11 logs since sunset, and the cabin was warm enough that she'd taken off her shawl. Let them talk, she thought. Let them laugh. The pipes worked, and when winter came in earnest, they'd see. December 19th, 1897. The temperature dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and it stayed there. Not for a day, not for two. For 11 straight days, the Judith Basin became a place where spit froze before it hit the ground, where breath came out in white clouds thick as wool, where exposed skin went numb in under a minute. The wind made it worse, gusting down from the mountains, shearing through gaps in walls, turning minus 31 into something that felt like 50 below. People burned wood like they were trying to heat the whole territory. Families that had stacked 2 cords for the winter were suddenly calculating whether they'd make it to February. The Hendricks family, for miles south, ran out entirely by the 3rd day and moved in with the Olsons, cramming 9 people into a cabin built for 4. Calvin Priest, the man who'd warned Sarah about fire hazards, was feeding his stove every 45 minutes just to keep his front room above 50 degrees. At the general store, men gathered around the pot-belly stove and shared disaster counts like battle reports. Frozen chickens, frozen wells, families sleeping in shifts so someone could feed the fire all night. Old Henrik Bjorn had lost 3 fingers to frostbite checking his cattle, and the wind kept howling. Sarah Morton's cabin sat on the north edge of the settlement, fully exposed to the worst of the blow. If any structure was going to fail, logic said it'd be hers, a widow, alone, with a jury-rigged stove that experts had called a death trap. But inside that cabin, something impossible was happening. Emma and Jacob slept through the night, not under 4 quilts, not shivering. They slept under 2 blankets, in a loft that stayed warm enough that frost never formed on the underside of the roof boards. Sarah fed the stove 9 logs at sundown, 11 at most if the wind was particularly vicious. Then she banked the coals, closed the damper halfway, and let the pipes do the rest. Because here's what Garrett Stillwell didn't understand about heat transfer. Iron conducts fast, yes, but that's exactly what makes it useful. The pipes weren't just sitting there absorbing heat. They were forcing the hot smoke and gases to travel horizontally through 6 separate sections before exiting the chimney. Every inch of that path was a chance for the heat to radiate into the room instead of vanishing into the sky. And when the fire died down to coals around midnight, those pipes stayed warm. Not blazing, not glowing, just warm, radiating steady, even heat for 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours after the last log crumbled to ash. By the 5th day of the cold snap, people noticed. Calvin Priest mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to Edna Colfax, who mentioned it at the store. Strange thing, Sarah's chimney isn't smoking near as much as ours. Garrett Stillwell didn't say anything, but he rode past her cabin twice that week, slow, watching the thin trickle of smoke from a stove that should have been roaring. On the 9th day, when half the settlement was running critically low on firewood and talking about sending a crew to the timber line in lethal cold, someone finally did the math. And the numbers were about to humiliate every man who'd called Sarah's work foolish. It was Garrett Stillwell who did the measuring. On the 10th morning of the cold snap, with the temperature still locked at -28 and families started to ration their last cords of wood, Garrett showed up at Sarah's door with a thermometer, a notebook, and something close to desperation in his eyes. "I need to see your wood pile," he said. Sarah stepped aside and let him count. She'd started the winter with 2¼ cords, modest for a single woman, but Daniel had always said it was enough if you were smart about it. Garrett walked the stacks, estimating what remained. Then he went inside, stood by the stove, and held the thermometer at chest height. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He moved to the corner farthest from the stove. 64 degrees. He climbed the ladder to the loft where the children were playing. 66 degrees. Then he pressed his palm flat against one of the iron pipes jutting from the stove. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that he pulled his hand back and stared at it like it had lied to him. "How many logs did you burn last night?" he asked. 9, Sarah said. "Maybe 10. I added 2 around midnight when the wind picked up." Garrett wrote that down. Then he walked to Calvin Priest's cabin, a quarter-mile south. Calvin had a similar-sized stove, similar cabin dimensions, similar exposure to the wind. Garrett asked the same questions. Calvin had burned 23 logs the night before. His cabin was holding at 54 degrees. He'd been up 4 times to feed the fire. His children were sleeping in the main room because the loft was too cold. Garrett visited 4 more cabins that day. He measured temperatures. He counted logs. He asked about sleep, about fuel consumption, about how often people had to wake to stoke the fire. And when he compiled the numbers that night by lantern light, the pattern was undeniable. Sarah's cabin, 68 degrees inside, using 9 to 11 logs per night. Heat retention for 4 to 6 hours after the fire reduced to coals. No frozen condensation on the walls. Children sleeping comfortably in the loft. Everyone else, 52 to 58 degrees inside, burning 20 to 24 logs per night. Constant stoking required. Ice forming on interior walls by dawn. Families abandoning upper sleeping areas because the heat didn't reach. The math was brutal. Sarah was using 45% less wood to maintain a temperature of 15 to 20 degrees warmer than her neighbors. But the most shocking detail wasn't the efficiency. It was what happened after the fire died. Calvin's stove went cold within an hour of the last log burning down. The iron radiated its heat fast and then turned into a cold lump of metal. By dawn, his cabin was barely above freezing. Sarah's pipes stayed warm until morning. The iron had absorbed so much heat during the active burn that it continued radiating for hours. Not enough to keep the cabin at 68 degrees, but enough to keep it livable. Enough that Sarah could sleep 5 straight hours without waking to feed the stove. Garrett showed the numbers to Calvin, then to Henrik Bjorn, then to the men gathered at the general store. No one argued. You can't argue with a thermometer. Calvin Priest, the man who'd called it a fire hazard, stared at the notebook and said quietly, "I was wrong." Henrik Bjorn, who'd lost 3 fingers that week, just shook his head. "We should have listened." And Garrett Stillwell, the senior builder, the man who'd told Sarah she was wasting good material. He folded the notebook shut and walked back to her cabin through snow that crunched like broken glass underfoot. Sarah was splitting kindling when he arrived. "I need to apologize," Garrett said. Sarah stopped mid-swing. "You measured?" "I measured." He pulled off his hat. "You were right. I don't know how you knew, but you were right. That system of yours, it's not just efficient. It's revolutionary. You've captured heat that the rest of us are throwing away." Sarah leaned on the axe. "My husband used to say heat doesn't care about reputation. It just follows the path you give it." Smart man. Garrett looked at the cabin, at the pipes jutting from the wall, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "I'd like your permission to copy this. And I'd like to pay you for the design." "You don't need to pay me," Sarah said. "Just tell people it works." By spring of 1898, 8 cabins within 30 miles had asked Sarah to install pipe systems in their stoves. She didn't charge much, just enough to buy food and keep the forge running. Some families paid in labor, helping her split wood, mend her roof, bring her venison when the hunting was good. Others paid in goods. One man gave her a laying hen. Another gave her a bag of flour and a promise to teach Jacob how to handle a team of horses. Sarah would arrive with her tools, measure the stove, drill the holes, and weld the pipes in place. She taught the families how to manage the dampers, how to bank the coals at night, how to check the welds for cracks each season. She was patient. She was thorough, and she never once said, "I told you so." Garrett Stillwell, to his credit, didn't hide his reversal. At the store, at church, wherever men gathered to talk about building and survival, he'd bring up Sarah's system. "I was wrong about the Morton woman," he'd say plainly. "She understood heat transfer better than I did, and I've been building for 40 years. If you're smart, you'll listen to her." People listened. The modification spread organically, the way good ideas do when survival depends on them. Some families called them Morton pipes. Others called them widow's coils or serpent stoves. A homesteader in North Dakota heard about it from a traveling preacher and built his own version using copper tubing. A trapper in Wyoming read about it in a letter from his sister and adapted the concept for a tent stove. Within 3 years, the design had scattered across the northern plains, not through official channels or building journals, but through oral tradition. One neighbor telling another. One winter proving what the last winter suggested. And Sarah Morton, the woman who wasn't supposed to know metalwork, became the person people rode 30 miles through snow to consult. She didn't brag. She didn't lecture. When someone asked her how she'd figured it out, she'd shrug and say, "I couldn't afford to waste heat, so I didn't." The technical principle was simple, though few people had the language to describe it in 1898. By forcing the hot smoke through a serpentine path before it exited the chimney, Sarah had increased the surface area of heat exchange. The iron pipes acted as radiators, absorbing thermal energy during the burn and releasing it slowly over hours. It was the same concept that would later inform rocket mass heaters, radiant floor systems, and modern high-efficiency wood stoves. But Sarah didn't need to know the engineering terms. She just needed to know that heat rises unless you give it another path. And iron, properly used, could hold a memory of fire long after the flames died. By the time Emma turned 12, she could weld as well as her mother. By the time Jacob turned 14, he'd installed pipe systems in 11 cabins across 2 counties. The skill passed down, practical and proven, the way all frontier wisdom passed down, not in books, but in smoke-stained hands and warm winter nights. Garrett Stillwell died in 1904. In his will, he left a note for his grandson. Listen to the people who solve problems, not the people who explain why problems can't be solved. I learned that from a blacksmith's widow who was smarter than me. Sarah Morton lived until 1923. She never remarried. She ran the forge until her hands couldn't hold the hammer anymore. And when she finally sold it, the buyer found a set of iron pipes in the scrap pile. The original 6, worn smooth from years of heat, kept as a reminder of the winter she'd refused to freeze quietly. There's a lesson in Sarah Morton's story that goes beyond iron and fire. Innovation doesn't always come from the people with the most training or the loudest voices. Sometimes it comes from the people who can't afford to be wrong. The ones who are cold or hungry or desperate enough to ignore what everyone knows and try what might actually work. Sarah wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a metallurgist. She was a widow with 2 children and a woodpile that wouldn't last the winter. She didn't set out to revolutionize heating systems. She just needed her children to stop coughing in the cold. And because she was willing to be mocked, because she trusted her observations over other people's assumptions, because she understood that heat doesn't care about reputation, she built something that saved lives. The pipes looked ridiculous, right up until they didn't. The welds looked dangerous, right up until they proved safer than wasting half your heat up a chimney. The whole system looked like a desperate woman's gamble, right up until the numbers showed it was smarter than 40 years of professional experience. That's the thing about survival wisdom. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't care if it's pretty. It just works, and then, if you're lucky, it gets passed down. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching this from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop that in the comments. And if you want more true frontier engineering that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. Next week, I'm showing you the backwards chimney that every builder in Wyoming said would suffocate a family, until it became the only design that survived the blizzard of 1888. You won't want to miss it. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.